Oh,
Yeah,
you did
I
that.
mean, we started
That was
early.
that. Yes, you did. You pulled that
I
on
just
that
got, I
summer.
couldn't wait, and I
Oh,
couldn't
yeah,
wait
that's
to
it.
start.
Oh.
Calling Chris Anderson. If this is Sunday, it must be Aldbourne. I don't know. Where are
No,
you?
close. We are at the Donington Valley in lovely downtown Newbury, which is near Aldbourne,
Okay,
and
fair enough.
finished that up today. Yep. So,
Fair
and
enough.
calling Rick Byer, you look like you're back in Chicago,
I am back in Chicago
which is you
for the
only the.
nods.
It's only the you're only the third most corrupt city in America.
I just read a news article that Illinois is only the third most corrupt state. I
I'm
imagine
disappointed by
another
it.
stai that I have close associations with, Rhode Island, is probably one of the top
Nipping
two.
at their heels.
Well, no, I imagine that they're one or two. They're a very corrupt place as well. So let's, we can, if George Luz is here, he can give us an update on Rhode
I'll
Island
ask him about
corruption,
that.
etc. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris and I are traveling the globe, but still somehow we managed to drag ourselves in front of the cameras to be here and to interview some great guests and talk about history every Sunday. And today we're going to be talking about interrogating high-ranking Nazi prisoners in Washington, D.C. during World War II, so that should be good. And hey, Chris, a big thank you, as always, to everyone supporting this effort via Patreon,
Absolutely.
especially our top shelf supporters who are
Absolutely.
listed here. Is your name on this list? If not, either we've made a mistake or you're not a top shelf supporter. So you can become one by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And of course, you can find out about upcoming shows on our website, historyhappyhour.net. Chris, who's with us? Anybody watching this show today?
Yeah, well, Xavier, so our Spanish contingent is
Oh,
with
so
us.
we got
that's
Spain
good.
in the house.
And, Lizzie Borden. So hello, Lizzie.
I see
Skip
we got
Cornett.
Okay, Tony from South Philly. So we have South
Yeah.
Philly in the house. Florida with Danny.
Doreen is back, so she must not be on stage, so that's good.
Okay, Sun City, Arizona, where it's 111 degrees Fahrenheit right now. And here's Frank, who says that our guest today was one of the most effective chief historians of the National Park Service. So we've already got people praising our guest, and he hasn't even started talking yet.
Oh, right.
Well, he talked to
Yeah.
us before the show. I mean, it's not like he's keeping quiet. Okay, stop, Rick. Okay, Chris, are we ready?
I think we
Please
are,
tell me
yes.
we're ready to move on to some actual
Yes.
content.
Yes.
Give me the cue.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, before we start our interview today, I know you're on a Band of Brothers tour, and of course the last surviving member of Easy Company, Bradford Freeman, died a week ago today. And you have been connected to the guys in this unit a long time, and I'm sure this is a milestone that you never wanted to reach.
No, it's you always expect it in one sense, but it's still a blow. They're such a huge part of my life, and I guess as my wife has told me when I get upset about these things, she said they will continue to be a huge part of your life, and there will not be a day that will go by that I will not think of them in some way. And so, in a way, being on a Band of Brothers tour not too long after getting this news is good for me and good to talk about them. And
Yeah, a good kind of way to remember him as you travel the route that they traveled during World War II. So I'm sorry for that loss. I certainly know how it feels being very close to so many of the Ghost Army soldiers who have passed away. We have so few left, so it's a tough thing. But as you say, it's not unexpected, but that doesn't make it a whole lot easier. So our condolences to you. To Mr. Freeman and his family, and we will try to remember.
we'll do our best.
All right, so we will try to make a transition from that to our topic today, which is also a pretty serious topic. During World War II, a top secret installation 15 miles from the White House conducted intelligence and espionage operations kept secret for more than 50 years. The facility at Fort Hunt was known only by its code name, P.O. Box 1142. And here, something like 15 German generals, thousands of other high-value Nazi prisoners were bugged and questioned by American interrogators, many of them who themselves were German-born Jews. So this was a very well-guarded secret for decades, and the details might have been lost to us but for the efforts of the National Park Service historians. And now the former chief historian for the Park Service, Robert Sutton, has written a book telling, another little-known tale from the annals of World War II. It's called Nazis on the Potomac, which is such a fabulous title. I have to say that the moment that I heard that title, Chris, I wanted to have that book on it. I didn't even know what it was about at that point, Bob, but I knew that I wanted to have the book on the show. And the subtitle is The Top Secret Intelligence Operation That Helped Win World War II. So, Bob Sutton, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And let me also pass along my condolences. I've had to deal with a lot of folks I've known who were in World War II who are gone. So I have a sense of how you feel. So, again, let me pass my condolences on to you.
Well, in World War II, Fort Hunt is a POW camp, but it's not very similar to the Luftstalags we see in the movies or the other POW camps in the U.S. It kind of resembles them a little bit, as you can see in the photo, in that it has barbed wire and guard towers. But this place is really different. Tell us a little bit about what was going on here, just as context for getting us started off.
There were three programs at Fort Hunt, and as you mentioned, it wasn't known as Fort Hunt at the time. It was called P.O. Box 1142 for the post office box where they got their mail in Alexandria. But it had three programs that functioned at Fort Hunt. One was a program that gathered intelligence with interrogations of German prisoners, and also listening in on their conversations. They bugged their rooms. They had hidden microphones all around the fort, and so they listened in on conversations around the fort. So that was one program, interrogation and eavesdropping. A second one was there was a program that capped MIRS, Military Intelligence Research Section. They translated and interpreted and then wrote reports on literally tons of captured German documents. And some of the most valuable books that were published that helped the Allies win the war came out of this program. And a third program, which was completely different from these two, was escape and evasion. And it had several functions. First of all, they had developed a cryptology system where they could communicate with soldiers who were in German POW camps. It was very successful. It worked pretty flawlessly throughout the war. So that was one thing. They could easily communicate with soldiers from Fort Hunt to these camps. They would do it through writing letters, and the person who was in charge of this program, Silvio Bedini, who later became very well known as a historian at the Smithsonian, he developed a system, and he said the most important thing was to get soldiers who were terrible writers. He said you can make terrible writers better writers, but you can't make good writers into terrible writers. Very interesting thing. But anyway, they communicated back and forth. And then they sent packages to the POW camps, things like transmitters that were in baseballs, transmitters that were in cribbage boards, maps that were in like Monopoly, were hidden in Monopoly boards and so forth. So that was one program. Another program was that they developed a whole system for downed pilots so that hopefully when they were downed, they could escape capture. So they had water purifying pills, they had maps, they had different things that hopefully would help them escape. So those were the three programs at Fort Hunt.
And so these all fell under the auspices of what was called the Military Intelligence Research Service, correct?
That's correct.
Right. And did this service exist before the war, or was this a wartime creation?
It sort of existed, but it was the actual names were MIS, Military Intelligence Section Y, and Military Intelligence Section X, and the other one was Military Intelligence Research Section. But they did exist. Okay. They did have intelligence before the war, but these were developed primarily for World War II, and they were very different from earlier efforts. One thing that was fascinating to me about the program, the interrogation and eavesdropping program, there was a lot of concern among the hierarchy in the government that eavesdropping was just wrong. There's the Secretary Stimson said, you just don't read gentlemen's letters.
Mail, right? Yeah.
You know that one, and so there was some concern about it, but they decided, this was something that was very important, and they should do it, and that was that. So that was something that was very, very different from earlier efforts.
Okay.
Well, they were Nazis, so it's okay to bug the Nazis. I think
I'm sorry. It was okay to bug the Nazis, but there's pretty good evidence that the Nazis had a sense that they were being bugged.
Yeah.
So the Army felt like this was really a terrific thing, getting surveillance on the Nazis. But some of the people who were actually stationed there, who did the interrogations and did the eavesdropping, felt like the interrogations were far, far, far more successful than the eavesdropping.
I wondered about what, in terms of interrogation and eavesdropping, what kind of techniques were used, and how much did this owe to a similar British initiative that they did with high-ranking Nazi prisoners that Helen Fry has detailed in some of her books and has talked about here on History Happy Hour as well. Was it kind of like linked to that, or completely unrelated, or what was the connection there?
Well, that's an interesting part of the story. The Army sent a team over to England, over to UK, in 1941, and they looked at everything. Spent several months actually analyzing every single phase of the whole, how the British dealt with German prisoners, primarily German prisoners. And so a lot of the things that they learned were very similar, because they tried to copy a lot of the things that the British had done. One thing that was different was the cryptology program. Silvio Bedini looked at the British system. He felt it was far too complicated because it had a lot of math in it. And he said he never had passed a math class in his life. So he wanted to modify that for his use. But there were some things that were different, but mostly they tried to copy the British system. And one of the things that the British did was they had what they call them, cages. I can't remember the term, where they had all around England, some of these castles and estates. That's where they interrogated Germans, and so they originally were thinking of doing that here, but they decided Fort Hunt was far better than any of the possible places that they looked at.
So was there coordination between British and American intelligence, or once it got set up,
very much
they
so.
kind of okay,
very much so. In fact, the MIRS, the documents section, there was actually a much larger office in UK that got the initial packages of documents, of captured documents. Right, okay. And so they looked at them, and then they sent most of them to Fort Hunt. There was actually a smaller group, but Fort Hunt was the one that actually produced most of the reports from World War II.
It's good to hear that there's coordination, because it seems like so many examples where the Americans basically said, we don't care about how you've been doing it, Britons, we know better, and we're going to do things our own way, or we're going to learn it from the ground up. So it's good to know that there's something that kind of offers the other side of the story.
There was some of that. There was some of that too. I think what the this whole MIRS, MISX, the escape and evasion. I think they they carried that a little further than the British. Now, that one thing they did, the British sent packages from bogus companies, right? And the Americans did that, so
Yeah.
that was similar. But they got a little bit more brazen with what they sent.
Is this
The
can I
Americans.
can I
Right.
we'll get back to the interrogation in a moment. And Chris, you have a question due, but I'm just jumping in on this. Famously, they made Monopoly sets that had stuff hidden inside some of the pieces that were sent to prisoners. Is this the kind of thing that went from the escape and evasion people over to American
Yes,
prisoners in Germany?
yes. So what they did at the beginning, there actually was a book written. I didn't. I just had a short chapter on that because there was a book written by a fellow who was actually in that program, Schumacher,
Right.
called The Escape Factory, and actually he wrote the book when he wasn't supposed to.
In
But
the 1990s, right?
yeah, that's a whole separate story. But he said that what at the beginning, their commander sent them out to buy everything they could think of to see what they could use to hide different materials in, and they found that something initially they thought these game boards were not good because they were made out of cardboard, but then they realized that they could actually take them apart and glue them back together and put all kinds of things in them. So it was just trial and error. They just tried to find what seemed to work well, and there's a whole I didn't get into it, but there's whole separate stories about how companies would develop these transmitters that could be hidden in baseballs and in cribbage boards, and that's I mean there's a whole series of things. Most of the companies that developed these things did it essentially gratis. They didn't
Yeah.
look to make any money from it.
So Bob, I think one of the parts of the story that was fascinating to me, and I'm sure fascinating to a lot of other people, is where the soldiers that worked at Fort Hunt came from, what their background was. Could you describe? They're a pretty unique set of characters that you talk about in the book, and so maybe talk about who was working in this organization, and your involvement with them, and that part of the story.
Yes, most of the actually soldiers that we interviewed, many of them came from Germany or Austria when they were children. They were from Jewish families, and they came from mostly from Germany, but some from Austria during the 1930s. And part of the reason that we were able to interview them, they were fairly young when they were at Fort Hunt, so they were still many of them were still alive. We did most of our oral history from 2006 to 2010, so most of these fellows are still alive. But some of their stories are just incredible. There are a couple that this really appealed to me. One young fellow's name was Rudolph Pins. He was raised in Germany, and most of these had exactly the same story. When they were young, they said there was they didn't really have any sense of anti-Semitism in Germany or Austria when they were young. But he, as he got a little older, he finally hit him when he went to a Catholic school, and one day the teacher called him in and said, "You need to see the principal." And the principal said, "Well, I'm sorry, but you can't go on a field trip this weekend because you're Jewish." And that's when it really hit him. His parents had arranged for him to go into a program. It was called the Thousand Children. Actually, there were more than that. It wasn't a government program, but the government sanctioned it, where Jewish groups would raise money in the United States to help children come. They had to be between the ages of about 10 and 16.
Is this like the Kinder transport?
Well, there was the Kinder transport went to England. This was a very
Yeah.
similar thing that came to the U.S. But anyway, he came. His parents arranged for him to come to the United States. He lived with a foster family in Cleveland, and he continued to communicate with his family. But when the war started, he didn't hear or anything from his family, and that was it. That was the end of it.
Mm.
So that was one story. I think one of the most fascinating stories from this period. There was a fellow named, oh gosh, sorry, I'm just drawing a blank here. I'll find his name here in a minute. But he went to school one day, and his teacher says again, same thing. Said you need to go see the principal. And he went to see the principal, and the principal said, "You can't go to school anymore." He said, "Why not?" "Because you're Jewish." Well, the interesting thing here was that he had no idea that his family had been Jewish. They had converted before he was born to Christianity. They never told him that he had a Jewish background. So it was a double whammy for him because he thought he was as Christian as anybody, which he was. But because his family had been Jewish, he was told he could no longer go to school. And so that was another story. And then there's some stories like some were able to escape, just barely get out of Germany, at the last minute before the Nazis attacked. So their stories are I mean, just that. I actually had a whole chapter on, I call it Escape from the Nazis, a whole chapter on this section. Which I think is really an interesting story. But when at the beginning of the war, some of these folks were really interested in joining the army because they wanted to get even with Hitler. So one person, his name is Paul Fairbrook, who's become a very good friend of mine, and I talk about him frequently. He was in the military intelligence research section. He and his family left Germany, went to Palestine, and then eventually made their way to the Netherlands and then to the United States. When the war started, he, like the next day, went to try to join the Marines, and he was told he couldn't. He tried to join the Navy, he couldn't. He tried to join the Army, he couldn't. Well,
because he's German.
He's German. I'm
right.
sorry. Yes, I didn't make that. Yeah, he
no,
was.
No,
German.
you did. But I mean, that's why. I'm presuming that's why they wouldn't let him join.
Right. He was an enemy alien, which meant that he was neither an enemy. He was an alien, but he certainly wasn't an enemy. So he couldn't join, and that was true of many of these folks who were at Fort Hunt early on. They couldn't join, but before long, they decided that the Army decided, you know what, that's silly. We should let them in, and then they started. Then they started to not only let them join, but they started drafting them into the Army. But many of them, when wherever they were assigned, they heard their German accent, and they said, are you German? Are you from Germany? And yes. Well, immediately they either sent them to Fort Hunt, or in more cases, to Camp Richie, which was a major intelligence training center. Some of them came to Fort Hunt. A majority of them went to Europe to interrogate German prisoners in Europe. But most of them immediately got American citizenship shortly after they were in the military. It turned out that this was I'm sorry. And you were asking.
No, you go ahead. Rick's not that important. You're much more important.
No, you're the guest. You're the guest. You get priority.
So
I'll just hide back here.
Well, this turned out to be just an amazing coup for the Army, because not only was German their native tongue, but they understood the nuances of the German language. They understood the nuances of German culture. They could communicate with these guys. One person that I've gotten acquainted with, he was not at Fort Hunt, but he was at Camp Richie, and then he went to Europe. Guy Stern, he said that he had tremendous success interrogating German prisoners because he loved soccer, and most Americans at that time didn't know a thing about soccer, but he did, and so he had an easy time communicating with the Germans because he knew about soccer.
Well, I was going to say that I was going to ask about the Camp Richie connection, because I'm sure a lot of people have seen the 60 Minutes piece on the Richie boys, and there's a lot of overlap with this story, right? Because some of the, as you say, many of the people who came to Camp Richie and trained in intelligence and were, German Jews, German speaking, they went to Europe, but some of them end up being part of this story at Fort Hunt, Virginia. Somebody asked us where Fort Hunt is. It's pretty near to Mount Vernon. And so there really is a strong overlap, isn't there? So I'm going to ask a two-part question. I never do this, but that's part one. And part two, I know I'm just trying to keep you off the questioning, Chris. Part two is, it must have been really hard for somebody who was Jewish, whose family had been persecuted, perhaps eradicated by the Germans, to start chumming up with these high value prisoners and making nice and interrogating them in these sort of "I'm trying to be your friend" kind of ways. That strikes me as really challenging.
It was, and the the you mentioned Camp Richie, and I probably should say a little bit about that. They one of the major training programs at Camp Richie was training soldiers how to interrogate Germans. And what they would do is they would have American German soldiers dress up as Germans and do everything they could to trip up these German American potential interrogators. And there's one story that I think is really hilarious. It's the Germans had a term for a field kitchen called a goulash canon. Goulash is a actually Hungarian, but the German became very popular in Germany. It's like a beef stew, and a canon is a cannon, and it's a crazy idiom. And if you don't know it, it's very it can be frustrating. Well, this German who was posing as a German Nazi started talking about a goulash canon, and the poor guy who was trying to interrogate him got more and more and more frustrated, and eventually they had the goulash going down the mountain, and so what they would do is they do everything they could to trip them up, and some of them actually just couldn't do it, and about 40% of them washed out. So as you said, that it was kind of tough because they had to sort of swallow what they thought of these folks when they were interrogating them. And most of them, when they were asked that question, most of the folks that we interviewed, when they were asked that question, they said, I looked at them that they were doing their job as I was doing my job. And once you could do that, and you realized that if you were in the field, you were going to try to kill them, and they were going to try to kill you. But now you were trying to get information from them. It just made things not necessarily easier, but made it more palatable.
So, Bob, speaking of these Nazis, walk us through how does a German find himself at Fort Hunt? I mean, what's the process that takes this guy from wherever he's captured and he winds up in Fort Hunt, Virginia? And also, what sort of Germans are they interrogating?
There were we call them high. Some look at it high ranking. That's not necessarily the case. It's more like high value Germans. Many of them actually were enlisted men. But what they would do, what the Allies would do, is generally when these folks were well, actually, there's two different sets here. Let me back up here. Most of the early prisoners that came through Fort Hunt were from captured or sunk U-boats. And so early on, most of these were sailors, and so they were taken from, if they survived from the U-boat, many of them came through Fort Hunt, and they were interrogated, and then Fort Hunt was not really a POW camp. It was very important, that distinction. It was an interrogation center, and generally they were there for a period of time and then sent on to a POW camp. So early on, most of them were from U-boats, but as the war progressed, as the Americans were more and more involved in the war, many of these interrogators who were in Europe, when German soldiers were captured, they in most cases were just sent to POW camps. But there might be something that the military would see had value. So, for example, there was one soldier they captured who'd been on the Eastern Front. And so they sent him to Fort Hunt. And it turned out he had very valuable information, because they really didn't know they didn't know a great deal about what was going on the Eastern Front. So he was, I believe, a corporal, but because he had been there and the information that he had, especially about like Russian tanks as opposed to German tanks and so forth, and how the Russians were treating German prisoners and how the Germans were treating Russian prisoners and so forth, was very valuable information. And so when they found someone like this, they would send them to Fort Hunt. Usually there were several layers of processing before they got to Fort Hunt. So in many cases, their initial interrogation would be in Europe. They were sent to a place in Pennsylvania called um, Pine Forest or Pine Furnace in Pennsylvania. It was had been a CCC camp. They were sent there initially, and that's where they were vetted even further to determine whether they would be valuable to send to Fort Hunt or not. And part of the thing at Fort Hunt, they couldn't accommodate a huge number of prisoners, so they had to go through this process to decide which ones were more valuable than others.
So, this is a story that, as you write in the book, you say that it could have been lost to history, or at least the details of it. I don't think that we normally think of the National Park Service as an institution that is uncovering secret World War II history. So, what is the story of how the National Park Service was instrumental in bringing the details of this to light? Because it's kind of an intriguing tale.
Well, first of all, there's this Schumacher wrote this book in 1990 called The Escape Factory. So the Army tried to buy up all the copies of it because they didn't want the story to be told then. But by about the middle 1990s, most of the World War II documents were declassified. And so most of the interrogations that were in the National Archives were now available for scholars. So around a few years later, around late 1990s, early 2000, the Park Service had one of the things that we do is called a historic resource study. And they hired a historian to do a historic resource study of Fort Hunt. And he went through the whole history of the fort. It actually has an interesting history. It was actually part of George Washington's river plantation initially. And he talked about that. But then he actually began to look at some of these documents of interrogations that were now available. And so the Park Service began to learn a lot more about the story as these documents became available. But the one thing they did not have at the time, they didn't know of any soldiers who were stationed there who they could interview who would give them information about Fort Hunt during World War II. So that part of the story I think is great, a wonderful little side piece here. So Fort Hunt is a big picnic area on the George Washington Parkway. And occasionally the park rangers would give tours of Fort Hunt. There was a coast artillery fort with these great big huge concrete batteries, and they talk about the history and go through the whole history sort of from the beginning. And then they'd start to talk about what happened during World War II. And at the end of that part of the talk, they'd say, we really would love to find people who were stationed here during World War II so that we can find out more about what happened. So one of these tours, a woman perked up and said, my former neighbor was here during World War II. He didn't say much about it, but I know he was here. And I know he's still alive. I think he's moved from here to Lexington, Kentucky, and he might be willing to talk to you. So one of the historians in the park, Brandon Bice, got in touch with this fellow because this woman had his information, asked to interview him, said, he could now talk about the story. He was very hesitant. In fact, they had to cancel the trip several times. Finally, he agreed to an oral history interview. So Brandon went to Kentucky. Actually, in his briefcase, he carried several of the interrogations that this fellow had done with his name on them. His name was Fred Michel. So he got there, showed him that he could now talk about the story, and he started talking, told the whole story. But more valuable than that, he asked Brandon asked him if he could name any other folks who were stationed there. So he gave him several names, and eventually they got a roster of the folks that were there. They started going through the roster, the names that Fred, Michelle, and others had provided, and by the end of this process, by about 2010, they had interviewed about 65 of the folks who were
Wow.
stationed at Fort Hunt.
Wow, that's a great. That's fabulous to preserve that.
So, Rick, I had a question, but maybe I saw Frank
You want
ask
to
the
take Frank's
question.
question?
Yeah, just because what I want to ask after Frank kind of takes us away from this direction. So let's
So go
post
ahead.
this up here. So, Bob, this is from one of our viewers
And Chris,
watch
you
most
just,
of our shows, so we want to make sure we get. What?
no, you
I
were
freeze?
frozen for a moment, but you're back.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so Frank watches all of our shows, and so he has this question: was there ever an occasion when the information obtained through interrogation was patently false or deliberately designed to mislead the interrogators?
That's a very good question, and I'm absolutely sure that that was the case, but I don't know of a specific example of that, unfortunately.
Right.
I mean, of course, yes,
Yeah.
but I don't know of specific examples. One thing I do know, though, is that they treated these prisoners very, very well, and most of the folks that we interviewed, and of course, most of my story is based on fairly late history of Fort Hunt. Most of the folks we interviewed um, told us that toward the end of the war, the German prisoners that they interrogated and listened to with eavesdropping were pretty clear that the war was going to end, and they wanted, if they were going to be on one side or the other, there's going to be a war with Russia, so they wanted to be as cooperative as they could be.
Right.
So that is mostly what makes up the story, because that was the information that I had available. But to answer the question, I'm sure there was, and one of the things that was very useful for the eavesdropping program was early on they had many Germans who were very dissatisfied with the Nazi regime, and they made it very clear that they'd be happy to do anything they could to help. They became what the fellows at Fort Hunt referred to as stool pigeons, or SPs, and they would room with German prisoners and do everything they could to get information from them, either in the rooms or around the fort. And this was a tremendously valuable asset to have these stool pigeons help out with the interrogations.
Well, and actually, I just want to pick up on that then, because that later on that was another question. That was a pretty risky proposition for some of these stool pigeons. Can you tell us a little bit about Werner Dreschler? Because he was a stool pigeon that it didn't really turn out so well for him.
Yes, he probably was the star of the SPs. The Army promised that he'd be fine, he'd be safe. They accidentally sent him to, when he was finished as a stool pigeon. I don't know how this happened. Of course, the Army didn't say. Sometimes they don't say they made a mistake.
Really?
Yeah, really. They accidentally sent him to Papago Park, which was one of the major. There's actually an interesting story there too, but where many of the U-boat prisoners were, Papago Park and Phoenix POW camp. The sailors from his U-boat actually were there. They recognized him. They had a kangaroo court and they killed him. And this is just one of the real tragic, horrible stories that I think comes out of World War II.
Yeah.
I wonder, what we have. So this is in operation, and we'll talk about this a little later because it continues after World War II is over. Is there a good example of intelligence gathered here that was materially useful in the war effort, right? So there's a big effort going on. We're interrogating a lot of people. I think we said that 15 German generals cycled through here,
Mm-hmm.
thousands of other German soldiers. They're being eavesdropped. They're being taken on field trips to Washington, D.C. They're doing all sorts of stuff to kind of get on their side and get information. So do we have an idea what we got out of it?
Well, most of the generals that were interrogated, not all, but many came after the war. They had a lot of useful information after the war. But they got a lot of information, good information. Let me just give you a couple of examples. One thing that they discovered, that the Allies discovered, was that they would have bombing missions on railroad terminals. Right? They would bomb them because they wanted to take out the materials that were being loaded on the trains. They wanted to take out the trains. And so they started bombing railroad terminals around Germany. But after a bombing run, the trains were running as if nothing had happened. So one of the pieces of information that they got was that the Germans were starting to load and unload on crossings, railroad crossings, because roads would cross there, obviously, and they could take the trains there. They were all over Germany, so it just made perfect sense. So they would load and unload at crossings, and that's why the trains were running as if nothing had happened. Well, as soon as this information was passed on to the Allies, they started looking for all of these crossings now and started bombing, and they had more success. Well, that's one thing. Another thing was that the Germans, their submarine areas where they kept their submarines had covers. They would cover these nests. What do they call them? Nests, I think. They would cover them, and so the Allies, especially in Hamburg, would bomb the areas that were supposedly the covers over the submarines. And then the submarines would start running as if nothing happened. Well, they found out that the Nazis had been tricky in that they put wooden covers further out to look like this is where the pin was, where they were keeping the submarines. Instead, they were in a concrete area further in, and as soon as they found that out, again, they had much more success bombing the submarine pins. One thing that was unfortunate, two men overheard a conversation between two German soldiers talking about Peenemünde, where the rockets were being developed, and they had not been fired yet. They passed that information on, and for whatever reason, apparently it never got to the higher ups that needed to get the information, and so the rocket program, the German rocket program, continued. Who knows what would have happened if the information would have? It could have changed things, but that was one thing that was problematic. They heard about it, but for whatever reason, it didn't apparently get to the higher ups. But on the other hand, the Americans and the Allies, the Americans and the British, were absolutely determined to try to find all of the plans and everything connected to the rocket system. They found out through interrogation that a German miner, could direct them to a salt mine where all these plans were kept, and they found they got there before the Russians did and got all the plans. That's just a couple of examples of some of the things that they found.
So, Bob, one of the aspects of the book that I found the most interesting, because I'd been sort of familiar with the interrogation techniques and some of the escape stuff from having Helen on the show to talk about that from the British perspective. But one of the things I found really fascinating were the color books. So can you tell us what the color books were and kind of a little bit more about that aspect of the operation? Because I think it's a seemingly mundane but very important part of what was going on.
Yeah, the color books. The most important of the color books was the Red Book. And it had a very interesting, you know why it was called the Red Book? Because it had a red cover. That was
It's a normal reason.
really hard, right? This was the Order of Battle of the German Army, and it had three different, primarily three versions The most important probably was 1944 version. What it did was it listed every single German organization down to the division level, and it would say, where it was, where it had been, who the commander was, who the chief of staff was, what their primary duty was. So that was one incredibly valuable thing. So they had a very good sense of all of the troops that were in, for example, Belgium and France before D-Day. So they had a good sense of that. They also went into great detail. This book went into great detail talking about different groups like the SS. They learned more and more about how ruthless the SS was, but also how they were elite troops, and they did just about everything in addition to being in the combat zone. They like managed the firefighters. They essentially were everywhere. So it probably I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say the Red Book might very well have been the most valuable piece that was available as a document for the Allies for D-Day. It was, and many said that. It said this was just a tremendously valuable piece for D-Day. But the next version, the 1945 version, the war was winding down. They knew that, but this became very, very useful as German troops were at the end of the war, when they were beginning to demobilize. They understood, we should watch out for these guys. These are probably pretty bad guys, and we need to deal with them. Or these are probably good guys, and we should deal with them a different way. So the different versions of the Red Book was very, very valuable. There was also a Green Book, which essentially was the same thing for the Japanese side, and that was developed partly at Fort Hunt, mostly in London, the MIRS office in London. The Gray Book, I can't remember all the different colors, Yellow Book, Gray Book. But they're also, one of the interesting things I think from MIRS was that they would stumble onto something occasionally that was very valuable. So Paul Fairbrook said that one of his jobs was to look at the organization chart for the German army, which was very detailed, very precise. And one day he noticed that there was a new box for a morale officer, and he mentioned it to his boss and his commander, and he said, this looks very interesting. And the one wonderful thing I think about this was all these guys were very motivated, and they needed very little supervision. So he said, why don't you pursue this? Why don't you find out what this is all about? And so he found out that after the assassination attempt on Hitler, there was a whole system set up to try to determine how loyal German officers and soldiers were to the Third Reich, to the Nazis. And he wrote a whole report on this. He got an award for it. But this is another thing. They would find something, it looked really interesting, and they would track it down and use it.
We've touched on this, but one thing that I found interesting is this is not a story that ends with the end of World War II, because people are being brought here and interrogated after the war, and it's also kind of a Cold War story in a way too, isn't it? You sort of have the seeds of some intelligence operations and things that are going to go on for many years later that come out of interrogations at Fort Hunt at the end of the war.
Yeah, this is a program called Operation Paperclip, and this was after the war. Both the Russians and the Americans were very interested in trying to recruit. The Americans recruit. The Russians, in some cases, actually kidnap Germans that they thought would be valuable.
It's a fine line between recruiting and kidnapping.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, they, especially scientists that seem to have value, were brought to Fort Hunt, but the whole interrogation system became a little different. It was more like, well, you're now in the United States, and you should look at this and this and this, and this is the money we have, and blah blah. It was more like they would make a pretty quick effort to try to determine whether or not they would be loyal to the United States, and then it became mostly a sort of a recruitment pitch. And there were several soldiers who we interviewed who had the title of morale officer. They were really young. They were like, just maybe in some cases 18, 19 at the end of the war. Their job was to make sure the Germans were happy. That,
Yeah.
we want you to stay in the United States, and so we want you to be happy, and we want to do whatever we can to make you happy, and that's our job. We're morale officers. And some of these folks were former were Jewish, who had escaped from Europe, from Germany and Austria and other places, and some of them were really kind of annoyed that all of a sudden these horrible people who had tried to kill them and their families were now being treated like kings, and it's perfectly understandable that that's how they would feel.
So,
Chris, did you
so
have
looking, yeah. Well, I just was curious. Looking back now at the war, what did they think about their service or their experience? Because they certainly, the people you talk about in the book had a somewhat unique wartime experience. What was their sense of what their unit had done, or how did they feel about what they had done?
It's fast. That to me was one of the really, I grew up. I'm old enough that I knew many, 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 many World War II veterans, even when I was young. And a lot of them talked about what they did. Most of them didn't talk about what they did. I had an uncle who actually flew with Jimmy Doolittle, and I didn't know that until after he was gone. But most because they were sworn to secrecy, because they weren't allowed to talk about what they had done with anybody, including their families. They were pretty circumspect. Some of them opened up and were very, very, very revealing about what they did. Some of them sort of forgot a few little details, which is fine. That would happen. But most of them were pretty open about discussing what they had done once they were allowed to do so. But remember, they had 50 years, they weren't allowed to say anything.
Right. Well, a lot of times it was kind of your effort in the Park Service that almost brought these guys together, wasn't it? It's not like they
Yes.
could have reunions after the war because officially they didn't exist and nothing happened there, right?
There was a big reunion. There was a small reunion in 2006, and a much bigger one in 2007. One thing that I wanted to talk about that I think is interesting, and I don't know whether you're going to talk about this or not, but at the time of this reunion, 2007, the information about Iraq, and especially Abu Ghraib and the way that Iraqi prisoners were being treated and tortured, was common knowledge by then. And the fellows who were at Fort Hunt wanted to make it absolutely clear, both in the interviews that we did and at this reunion that we sponsored, that they did not torture any German prisoners ever. And that to me was one of the most important parts of this whole story. They got tremendous information by treating them well. If you tell me something, I'll go buy you a steak dinner. If you tell me something, we could keep playing ping pong or horseshoes, or, go swimming, go to movies. And that was a very, very critical part of this story, that they treated them well. Now, of course, there are going to be some Germans that don't want to talk. And that's the case in many of these things. But they had a wonderful way to deal with that. There were two Russian-American soldiers at Fort Hunt dressed in Russian uniforms. And so let's say a German was recalcitrant, didn't want to talk, say, I'm not going to tell you anything. Well, the result was this Russian would be in the room and they'd say, oh, you don't want to talk to us? How about Ivan here takes you to the Soviet Union? Maybe they would like to hear what you have to say.
So we had our own version of "We'll send you to the Russian front."
Yeah, and that worked remarkably well. That was a great success at Fort Hunt. But again, they wanted to make us understood that there was just that they did not have any corporal punishment of any soldier, German soldier.
Well, and I found that given their background, or a lot of their backgrounds, I found that very moving part of the book, that they were so insistent that that's not how they operated.
Right.
That was very interesting.
There's a bunch of other questions that we'd like to ask, but we're running out of time. But one question that somebody asked us, actually one of our guests asked early on in the show, that I wanted to get to is there anything left? Is there anything there that you can go and visit at Fort Hunt, which is, I guess, a park now, that will give you any sense of what went on there during World War II?
No. No, after the war.
Don't take too long answering, Bob.
Yeah, I guess you got the message that we're running out of time.
No, there's actually one. There's one house that was actually built early on in the fort that's still there. The concrete gun batteries that were there as part of the Coast Artillery Fort when it was built around 1900 are still there. But mostly it's a large picnic area. Now, one thing the Park Service has done, which I think is terrific, they put up a monument to these folks and a flagpole in the middle of the fort. And they've done some interpretive history there, but it's mostly what was there just isn't there. And part of the agreement was that the fort actually belonged to the Park Service before the war, and so they had to do an agreement with the Army to actually use this fort during the war, and the agreement was they could use the fort for during the whole World War II plus 1 year, but also the agreement was whatever they built they would have to tear down, and so that's why
it's
a
great
lot
for
of the
preservation.
Yeah.
Bob Sutton, thank you so much for joining us today. And as I say, there's lots more we could ask. We might email you a couple of questions that people put to us and ask you if you can give us answers to them. But so appreciate it. And your book, I want to just mention it again, is called Nazis on the Potomac, the Top Secret Intelligence Operation that helped win World War II. And I want to also mention, because I think it's worth people knowing, that many of these transcripts are up on the internet as part of the Fort Hunt Oral History Project, and we just put that link up on our page so that people can also access that and take a look at the oral history. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, you take care.
Thanks, Bob.
You
Take
too.
care.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And so I saw a couple of questions there that I'd be interested in answers to, and one was concerning the Japanese equivalent, which there was one.
Yeah.
And we'll try to get those to Bob and maybe put those answers up on our Facebook page. And I want to mention our show next week, Chris, because we're doing one. It's
you and I will have lots of intense discussions next week.
I sense already a bit of conflict coming next week. We're going to jump back in time to that one subject that Chris and I can never agree about: the American Revolution,
the American War of Independence.
It's the most beautiful, purest conflict in history. And our guest is Richard Middleton, who's the author of a new biography of Lord Cornwallis. And we know Cornwallis as the British commander who surrendered to George Washington at Yorktown. Can I mention that again, Chris? He surrendered.
He fought valiantly till the end.
Very
until the Royal Navy
surrender to George Washington at Yorktown.
He decided to bring peace. Yeah, I'm not bitter about it at all.
But listen, he you'd think after that he would head home in disgrace. But in fact, in some ways, it's really kind of the beginning of Cornwallis's career, which goes on for another 20 years of soldiering and diplomacy, statesmanship. So it's very, very interesting.
Good governance.
It involves India and Ireland, and another area that we can disagree on, and it was all hearts and flowers in Ireland, but not so much. Anyway, we'll get the lowdown next week on Lord Cornwallis, and of course that's also going to be, if any of you are folks coming along on our our Revolutionary War Southern Theater Tour,
Yes.
the road to Yorktown, then we're going to be covering some of that ground in our interview next week. So,
Very nice.
terrific
Take
show
that.
today, Chris. It was fun. I'm glad you
Yes,
you were able
absolutely.
to join us there from the town that I can never remember where you're staying in the hotel, the name of which I can never
Right,
quite
I can
recall, but I
never
know it's near Oldbourne, so that's the main
Yes.
thing.
Close
And,
enough.
Thank you everybody for joining us today, and
Thanks, everyone.
yeah.
Be safe, everybody. Thank you.